between not getting enough information about the situation we're in and wanting to completely escape from any and all news reports. There are no two better people in this world to help us make sense of our current times than Ellen and Mark, and I'm so happy to be able to introduce them. Before I do, I want to point out that this webinar is one of many online ways for ducks to connect with one another and with the school we all love, particularly in the coming weeks and months. If the University of Oregon has your contact information, you would have received last week via email the first issue of our Duck Nest newsletter that typically highlights activities and resources available to you electronically, whether they're webinars like these or also fun Zoom backgrounds of campus locations that you can download and use. If you know people who didn't receive this email, tell them to update their information with the U of O. At the end of the presentation slides, you'll see an email where you can send your updated contact information. But for those who can't wait, the email is simple. It's engagement@uoregon.edu. So even though we're keeping our distance to save lives, there's no need for us to be isolated. Join us for these webinars as you eat a meal, have a beverage, or enjoy a snack. You could even participate as you work out. That's the beauty of online engagement. So let me do a brief introduction of Ellen and Mark, and then we can hear directly from them. Dr. Ellen Peters is the Philip H. Knight Chair and Director of the Center for Science Communication Research in the School of Journalism and Communication here at the U of O. Ellen explores how policymakers, physicians, and other experts can enhance public understanding of science and technology by advancing the science of science communication. Ellen is an academic expert in decision-making in the science of science communication. Her forthcoming book, Innumeracy in the Wild, presented by Oxford University Press, explains how numeric ability supports the quality of the decisions we make and the life outcomes we experience. We also have Mark Blaine, who's Professor of Practice and Associate Director of the Center for Science Communication Research. Mark is an award-winning writer, investigative reporter, and editor. His focus at the SOJC is on storytelling, new media, and science communication. He has developed several experiential learning programs that focus on journalism fieldwork. In addition to teaching, Mark produces science documentaries in partnership with Vision Maker Media, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and Oregon Media. During Ellen and Mark's presentation, feel free to enter your questions into the chat field. My colleagues, Caitlin Elwood and Lauren Barkley, also members of the Digital Engagement Task Force, and I will sort the questions and ask them after the formal presentations are over. So without any further delay, let me introduce our first speaker, Dr. Ellen Peters.
James, thank you so much. I'm actually trying to figure out how to, there we go, it actually worked. Webinars are a fun new challenge that those of us in academia have today. And so we're all learning how to use it. James, thank you for inviting us, and also many thanks to the U of O Alumni Association for inviting both Mark and I to come talk with you today. And thank you guys for taking the time out of your day to come and listen to us. Also, a special shout out to the folks from the Sisters Science Club. I was so sorry I wasn't able to come give a talk to you guys. And also to the SOJC students from J361. Thanks for joining us. I met my husband, Martin, here at the University of Oregon. We're a proud U of O Duck family, including our daughter, Michelle, and her husband, Eric. But Martin is also a coronavirus statistics stalker. From the beginning of the epidemic in China, he spent time every day looking at coronavirus statistics from China, in the US, in Lane County, and even in predictive models. He wants to know and he wants to be informed, and he feels compelled to look each day. And not just each day, he feels compelled to look multiple times every day. Early on, I could tell it was making him really anxious though. He was starting to look every day and look multiple times a day. And he was watching the numbers in China grow and grow. And it was simply making him anxious from what I could tell. And the thing is, Martin is definitely not alone. Thanks to rapid funding from the National Science Foundation and an amazing lab group that I have at the University of Oregon, we were able to quickly start a longitudinal survey. And what we're doing is we're tracking reactions to this real-time emergency among a group of Americans. We started looking this past February. In about mid-February, about half of the people we're tracking reported spending at least some time every day looking at coronavirus statistics. And I've been calling them the statistic stalkers, and my husband is definitely one of them. By early March, almost 2/3 of people reported stalking the numbers. And by last week, almost 90% of us stalked the numbers each and every day. And some of us spent a lot of time looking at statistics. In fact, just last week, about 29% of people reported looking at the numbers for at least an hour every day, and some of them looked for considerably more time. Like Martin, a lot of us think that keeping track of the latest statistics is important right now. But the thing is, our past research has shown that people aren't always as great with these numbers and data as we'd like to think we are with the numbers and data. Numbers can actually mess us up. For example, we can be misled by how options are described, such as whether a pandemic's effects are described in terms of mortality, like 1% of people are expected to die who get infected, or if the same number is described in terms of survival, 99% of people are expected to survive. The numbers are logically the same in both of those frames, but people, including experts even, end up feeling worse oftentimes when it's described in the negative frame rather than in terms of the positive.
Lauren, do you see that question?
No, I don't. Okay. Another way that numbers can mess us up is that people can be seduced by compelling stories, or they can even be seduced by a scary outcome like COVID-19, so that they completely ignore the numbers, even when they think they're paying attention to them. So sometimes we have numbers in front of us, and we think we're processing them and understanding them and using them, but really what's happening sometimes is that some scary outcome or a compelling story ends up being what's sort of overwhelming our reactions. Obsessing over the statistics every day can even cause us to overreact. For example, we know that very smart stock traders who are looking at buying and selling stocks on the stock market, these day traders tend to stalk the stock market, but it turns out that they often lose money because they mistake noise in the market for a signal to buy or sell. With our grant, we're able to study statistic stalking and also how people's emotional reactions change in real time. So we're actually tracking people's responses over time, rather than what usually happens in research is we wait until the crisis is over and then we ask people after the fact about what do they think they were feeling and thinking as the crisis was going on. Instead, we actually get to look in real time. And understanding how emotions change during the pandemic is really important. And the reason is we know from past studies that people use their emotions in 3 very different ways simultaneously. They use their emotions first to assess how dangerous the situation is, but they also use their emotions to directly motivate what it is that they do and don't do. And on top of that, they use their emotions to guide their thinking. And we're going to talk a little bit more about each one of these. So first, people often use their emotions instead of logical analysis to evaluate, well, how risky is this situation for me? How dangerous is it? What ends up happening is they use their emotion as a substitute for other information, like the actual numeric chances of being infected or of being harmed by the virus. If they feel bad about the situation, they think it's more dangerous. They perceive more risk. If they feel less bad about the situation, they think it's less dangerous. We use those emotions as substitute information for other information like statistical risks. Thanks to our NSF funding, we have begun to understand more about how the public is reacting across the course of this pandemic. Like many of us, people across the US are worrying more and more. So what you can see on the left side of this slide is the percent of our respondents who reported feeling very fearful or extremely fearful about getting the coronavirus in the future. And we've measured it so far at 3 points in time, just like we had measured statistic stalking. As you can see, 7% of people, a fairly small proportion, were very to extremely fearful in mid-February. And that number increased to 14% at the beginning of May and then to 29% last week. We then seem to use those emotions to tell us, well, how risky is this situation? How dangerous is it for me? And what you can see on the right now is that we seem to use our emotions to tell us how risky the situation is. So on the right is the percent of the same people who reported being somewhat likely to completely certain that they would get infected by the coronavirus. Consistent with past research, as fear rose on the left side, people's perceived chances of getting the coronavirus, their perceived risk, rose on the right side. Last week, more than half of our respondents thought they were somewhat likely to completely certain that they would get infected. My group plans to continue tracking these reactions as the situation unfolds. Emotions simultaneously act in two other ways as well. Our feelings are powerful and compelling motivators of our behaviors. For example, to socially isolate, to responsibly stockpile the kinds of supplies that we need, because many of us are living out of our homes at this point and aren't going to work and aren't going to the grocery store as often. It also is a powerful motivator of things like washing hands. And all of those positive behaviors are things that, that emerge because we feel, in part because we feel more fear. At the same time, these kind of emotions powerfully motivate other kinds of, maybe not as positive kinds of behaviors. Things like uselessly hoarding supplies or acting in racist ways. And then finally, negative emotion causes people to focus on information in particular ways. When we feel more fear, we tend to focus more on the negatives. In this case, the onslaught of negative information about the coronavirus. When we feel bad about a risk, we tend to seek out more information about it. And there are good reasons to do that. Presumably, that's going to help us to prepare better for the future. And so the question becomes, and the question for my husband becomes, is stalking the numbers a good idea or a bad idea for you? The answer to that, though, isn't straightforward. It actually depends. And it depends because we need information to help us prepare for the future. It turns out that fear also helps us prepare for the future. Remember, it helps tell us how much risk there is. It helps to motivate important behaviors that perhaps we want to take. But wanting more and more information is psychologically one of the ways that our minds can actually trick us. We can drown in too much information. Even though we want more, it can turn from being helpful to us to actually harming us. Even though we although we assume that when we look at the numbers, we understand them and we interpret them accurately, we do kind of forget what kind of effects risk statistics have on our own emotional health. People who look frequently at coronavirus numbers may be zeroing in on the scary stuff that the media often provides. Those are things like the numbers of people who have been infected or the number of new deaths that day, while not really thinking about the numbers of people not infected and those who have only mild to moderate symptoms. This focus on negative information instead of on more positive information may underlie the statistic stalker's greater fear. We also know, by the way, from studies on the Zika virus, so this is a virus from a number of years ago, we know from studies on that virus that the more that people thought that they knew about the Zika virus, the more they realized they didn't know enough. And that feeling of not knowing made people more scared. And then finally, research has also found that repeated media exposure to past community crises has led to heightened stress responses. And as you can imagine, people are feeling fairly stressed right now. And that repeated media exposure that leads to heightened stress responses ultimately led to downstream negative effects on those same people's health. So what you might do in terms of trying to figure out, is this good for me or bad for me to stalk the statistics, is you might ask yourself two questions. First of all, do you feel much worse when you check the numbers? But then you should also probably ask yourself a second question, because information can help. Is it helping you to prepare in any way to go ahead and stalk the statistics? Because it could be that stalking the statistics and looking frequently at the media about news about the coronavirus could help you have more accurate knowledge about what to do, or it could help you just feel more confident about doing those things. But the thing is, if you're feeling worse and you realize it's not really helping you, you're just stalking and you're not getting much out of it, you might consider stepping away from the news for a day or two. At the Center for Science Communication Research, or SCR for short is what we call it, we try to understand the psychology of how people process scientific messages, like statistics in the news, for example. And we go further and we try to understand how they make decisions based on that information. We then take what we learn to figure out how can we help people make better decisions. With statistic stalking, for example, we concluded that sometimes stepping away from the news might be best, although it is up to you. It depends on how it's affecting you. In other kinds of research that we do, we take a look at how can we craft messages, for example, to help heart patients better understand risk, or to help people better understand what's going on in the environment. We need evidence-based science communication now more than ever to best communicate about scientific issues, but also to propel effective decision-making and action around issues related to COVID-19, for example, around issues related to the environment, and also to a myriad of other important scientific and health issues. The vision of our center is to lead cutting-edge science communication research that addresses complex problems in these areas and that ultimately improves evidence-based decision-making for individual as well as for policy decisions. Our vision also includes teaching others about best methods for science communication so that they can go out and teach others and so that they themselves can communicate science better. Ultimately, serving our mission means that we will make complex science more useful and we will improve the human condition through it. To do this, we sometimes talk to policymakers. So for example, I did a webinar last week with public officials from Congress, the CDC, and governor and city mayor's offices around the country. The science of science communication provides evidence-based answers that can help public officials both inform as well as support their constituents during the COVID-19 pandemic. SCR also reaches out to the public through the media and also through webinars like this one. I wrote about statistic stalking, for example, in a recent op-ed in the New York Times. But we've also written for other venues, places like The Conversation and The Washington Post. And we've also appeared in numerous other newspapers, radio programs, and TV spots. So what does science communication research suggest that you can do today with respect to COVID-19? First is what we learned from the statistic stalking paper. Do you know enough now to keep yourself and your family safe? If so, consider whether you really need to look at the news again, or do you really need to talk with others about it multiple times each day? I have to admit, in my own life, I've been talking far too much about it, and I must confess I'm a statistic stalker just like my husband is. I shouldn't just blame him. But I have to also say that I've started looking for stories about COVID kindness, the things that people are doing to help each other, help their neighbors, help someone who's at the grocery store. On the other hand, you might be becoming complacent. Some of us are getting quite bored with social distancing. And in that case, you might want to read more about the statistics. You might want to learn more about what's going on, really in order to sort of induce some fear in yourself. And you can then use that fear as a tool for yourself to motivate actions like continued social distancing and careful hand washing, and also gathering information so that you know for sure that you know what to do in various situations. Doing this will help protect the rest of us too. Second, you might want to go out and find the numbers. This can help you correct misperceptions that you might have. Early on, when Martin was starting to get anxious about the number of deaths in China and in the US, he searched for the information that the large majority of people, 80% in fact, have only mild to moderate symptoms. Numbers can also give you a more complete perspective. The media, as I mentioned before, tends to provide the negative frame of stories. In this case, the number of people who are infected or the number of new deaths in some particular area. And what's interesting is that as decision makers, people tend to stop with the information that was given to them. So they think about the number of people who are infected, but they don't end up thinking as much about the number of people who weren't infected. And so they don't consider the more positive frame when they're given just, when they're given just the negative frame. If those negative numbers are depressing to you, though, you can actually use the number infected and how many people there are in the population to calculate the number of people who are not infected in that same population, and then translate those numbers into the proportion infected and the proportion who are not expected to be infected. Of course, how many of us will get infected is important. It's important to know, but so is the percent of us who won't get infected, and that second number may be better for our mental health. The third thing that you can do today is get your information from people and groups that you trust. In our surveys, our respondents across the political spectrum had the greatest trust in the CDC, and they also had the greatest trust in their own doctors and in other kinds of clinicians. Getting information from trusted sources is particularly important because messages from trusted sources are more persuasive to us. People follow recommendations more when they come from a trusted person or group. The fourth thing you can do to take effective action, we need to know, the fourth thing is that in order to take effective action, we do need to know accurately what to do. So we have to have the right facts. We always need to have the right facts when it comes to what are the most effective behaviors that we can be doing right now. But we also need to feel confident that we can do it and that we can be successful doing it. So remind yourself that this pandemic can be stopped, and remind yourself about what you can do and what in fact you probably are doing right now. And finally, we're more likely to take actions that we see other people taking too. Notice what other people are doing, and notice that oftentimes people are doing what's recommended, the same kinds of things that you're probably doing. In fact, 92% of people in the US are social distancing right now, according to a recent poll by Kaiser Family Foundation. We're in this together, and we're going to stay in this together. I'll wind up by saying that this situation is incredibly uncertain. It's alarming, and it's unfamiliar to each and every one of us. At the same time, when the rubber hits the road, we're the ones who are going to make the decisions that will ultimately allow us to tame this monster. We decide how much to keep up with the news and how dangerous we think COVID-19 is for us. Importantly, we are also the ones who decide how much to protect ourselves and our families through hand washing and social distancing and other kinds of behaviors. Many of these decisions relate to how well we understand, engage with, and use science-based messages about COVID-19. In other words, you're the captain of your own ship in this case, but where you steer yourself also ends up influencing the people around you, and including in your community and in the nation. You get to make the choices, though, about how to navigate this new world of information and action. You also get to decide, by the way, how to talk to others about COVID-19. Communicating effectively with family and friends depends on what they know and how they feel, though, just as it depends on what you know and how you feel, whether those communications are effective for you. If you find that a family member or a friend is particularly anxious, you might choose, for example, to frame information in a positive way, to talk about the number of people not infected, or the proportion of people who suffer only mild or moderate symptoms, rather than framing it in the more negative way that the media often does. On the other hand, you could also provide both frames if you want to provide a more complete perspective. Key to all of this is research on evidence-based communication that will help us enhance individual welfare as well as the welfare of the public. By learning more through communication research and practice, we can ultimately help people understand and use information effectively to address some of society's most pressing problems, including COVID-19. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. Next up is going to be SCR's fantastic Associate Director, Mark Blaine. So it's all you, Mark.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, James. Let me just give me a second here to switch this over. Okay. Okay, can you see me okay? Okay, hi. I'm Mark Blaine. I'm a journalism professor and a journalist. You know, I'm titling this "Where to Begin: The Challenges of Telling Stories about Science." And beginnings, as any storyteller will tell you, they just aren't so simple, and they usually aren't where we expect them, whether we're telling a story or fixing a problem. We have a couple problems in this issue of science communication. Whoops. Hold on. Oh, hang on just a second. Is that where?
We don't see your screen yet, Mark.
Yeah, sorry. I don't know. Can you could hear my voice though, right?
Yep, no problem.
Okay, so I want this share. Sorry about that. Ah, no.
Got it.
Got it? Okay. All right, now, good, you got me? All right, so we have a couple of big problems, as I would identify them, in doing the practice of science communication. And you know, one of them has been around for a while, and it's this idea that we are spending billions of dollars annually on science communication, or on scientific research in the last half century, and it's paid huge dividends for society. But the institution and the institutions devoted to scientific inquiry remain among the most trusted in society. But we've seen cracks in this, and this is a strategy pioneered by Big Tobacco, written about beautifully by Naomi Oreskes at Harvard in Merchants of Doubt. And I think this is the place where there's an interesting opportunity too in science communication practice to think about, okay, how do we address these issues in the future as, science in some cases is under attack. So bring along COVID-19, and here we are. And as a journalism professor, I'm going to come at this also from the news organization perspective, because one of the fallouts of this is likely that a lot of local news organizations in particular will continue to face disruption, which is a nice word for maybe very well be going out of business. But people still need that information that they can apply to their daily lives. And so, this is a fundamental struggle that we've got. So as our worlds have gotten quite a bit smaller in this COVID-19 epidemic, we are so much more in need and desiring information, as Ellen just shared with us, and all the ways that we go and do that. And in so many ways, we're relying on the experts on the front lines to be telling the story and telling it well, and they're often telling it directly to us. Well, this brings up kind of a fundamental strategy that we're addressing here at the J School. We really need to look at distributing the responsibility for communicating science more broadly. Just this morning, there was this story that got up there from the Washington Post. Coronavirus crisis is devastating the news industry. Many newspapers won't survive it. It tells the story of a reporter, Bree Zeltner at the Cleveland Plain Dealer, who's a health reporter who's been just doggedly reporting the story of COVID-19 for her readers, and she's just been laid off. So where is the connection, and where are our abilities to connect with the public in this way? And I think it's gonna require us as a society to really pull together, and a lot more of us to be communicators. So the front there is partially in journalism, but a focus that we've got here is around science in particular, and what can scientists do to be part of this? As many of you will probably be aware, though, there is a tension between science and story, as well there should be. As Ellen pointed out, people relying purely on emotions can go down paths that aren't helpful at all in assessing their own risk or assessing risk societally. There's a great quote here from a paper a couple of years ago from Michael Dahlstrom and Dieter Schiffli. How can science preserve its credibility as curator of knowledge while engaging audiences with a communication format that is agnostic to truth? And I think that's a really important idea there, that science, or that stories, they can be about a lot of things. Think about fake news and all of the churn in society that we have now. What we really need to look at doing is pointing stories in the right direction, and perhaps helping some of those frontline people who are now being drafted to be storytellers to do it in a responsible and effective way. So what does that look like? On the journalistic level, a thing that I would argue for is that we have for too long focused in science reporting on the end of the scientific process, on discovery and on the outcomes of science. And that's left us really needing a broader understanding of how science happens. I mean, you don't have to look much farther than the vaccine, the reporting about vaccines that is going on right now, and the development process of that. Even if it's speeded up, it's a year and a half. Well, there's a process there that we need to engage in, and the public is impatient. And so how does that happen? What is the sequence of things that are happening there? As we get into this, looking at how to cover the process of science in an interesting and engaging way, so that the public really comes to understand what science is doing, and that it is such a fundamental piece of why we have the quality of life that we have today. This is also a strategy for diversifying the voices of scientists and bringing more voices to the public and to a variety of audiences. I've shared here a slide from probably my favorite John Oliver piece, a mathematically representative climate change debate, where he brings in 97 people in lab coats representing scientists and 3 climate change deniers. There's an interesting moment there. It's to think about how to get beyond these old ideas of false balance that's been created by the kind of he said, she said structure of a lot of reporting that we've done, and particularly a lot of science reporting. How do we move beyond that? Well, giving voice to scientists may very well be one piece of that. So how do we do that? Well, we've been working with the Knight campus and with a few other groups on campus on a series of trainings that look at how can we intervene in science messaging and in the stories that scientists are telling about their own work, whether they be to a colleague or to a potential collaborator in an adjacent field, or all the way out to the public. And these focus on some very simple rubrics that identify kind of key points in narrative. And among those are attention, timing, motivation, and scale. But I think the twist here is to really think about how are these researchers then figuring out what that audience, whoever it is that they're talking to, what do they need? What is their level of understanding? What's the platform that they're navigating? And then being able to tailor those stories to clearly articulate that research to that audience. In doing that, this proposes a model that sort of, that's a pretty traditional model of scientists tell a story, there's a receiver, and good things happen. But it also encourages listening. It encourages an interaction and a level of engagement that's important to building this relationship in a more thoughtful way. So what are we doing with this? Well, back to the beginning, okay? I'd say the first thing, begin with the beginning, scientists need to be doing science. That's the fundamental piece of it. But perhaps part of scientific training in the future really needs to look at this science communication component and address, how are scientists, how is science as a broader entity engaging with the public and, showing the public the ways that it is of deep value to society. Very specifically, in the School of Journalism and Communication, we are, as I mentioned, building some science story training modules in collaboration with the Knight campus and with some other groups. We're also developing a science communication undergraduate minor and a science communication graduate area of specialization, as well as some workshops and some other, and just conversations and research projects and collaborations. So it's pretty robust and an interesting time to be doing all this. And I'd just like to say thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you all today. And James, I think it's back to you.
Thank you so much, Mark, and also thank you, Ellen. So as Caitlin, my dear colleague, has been encouraging on the group chat, if you have questions, please pose them, and then my colleagues will direct them to my attention, and I'll ask them as many as I can get through. But again, Ellen and Mark, thank you so much for valuable information and in many ways validating just sort of how many of us are feeling in the midst of having so much information that relates to our health, our security, and that of our loved ones. Let me start with a question that has been posed, and the question has to do with the media that people are getting their information from. So, the question was just simply, at least in terms of, Ellen, some of the research that you've done, as people are providing, I guess sharing their advice and insights from their perspectives, are you finding what sources of media people are going to? Oh, Ellen, you're on mute.
Again, we're all learning how to use this equipment. Thanks, James. So we are actually looking at that. We haven't looked at the data on it yet, though. So at each of our 3 time points, we're asking people how much they are watching television versus listening to the radio, versus paying attention to various kinds of social media. And what we're planning on doing is we'll be linking those kinds of responses in with the kinds of emotional responses people are having, their risk perceptions, and the kinds of protective behaviors they might take on. But we haven't actually looked at the data yet. We're looking forward to it, but we have this mass of data, and we're kind of doing it one piece at a time.
Great, thank you so much, Ellen. Another question has come in is, can you talk about how Science Communication Research Center helps Oregon, how it helps our community, any direct impacts that you can either aspire to or even point to thus far?
So several different ways. Maybe I'll take a first crack at it, and then I think Mark probably will have another answer. Our center has three main thrusts to it. The first one is research, the second is teaching, and the last one is outreach. And I'll talk a little bit about research right now. The research that we do on purpose targets problems that are important to Oregonians and that are important to the nation. So looking at COVID-19, this is not something that's just important to the nation, although we're looking at, in the research I happen to be doing, we're looking at a broad spectrum of people across the US. These are problems that are important to every one of us today and right now. And what we're trying to understand is, how does the human mind work in such a way that we can then try to help Oregonians as well as others to make better decisions in their lives. Other kinds of research that we're looking at, another team member of ours, Dr. Holly Smith, is looking at messages around for earthquake warnings. And that's something that's more specific to the Pacific Northwest and to Oregon. And there's a variety of other things that we've been doing as well. Mark, do you want to make any other comments?
Sure, yeah. I mean, so first of all, the teaching that we're doing and the training is based in Oregon. So quite a few of the people who are doing that are here or will stay here or in the Pacific Northwest. In addition, Holly and Holly Smith, who Ellen has mentioned, have been working on a project about wildland fire and communicating the science of wildland fire in rural communities, in particular in Oregon, and doing research and some practice on that as well, with some collaborators here at the U of O and at Oregon State. So there's some ways that it's that it's definitely moving around within the state and within the region. We've also got a climate change component that we've been building that existed before the center was created. So we're looking at a lot of those issues. And hopefully, in a few years, we will have some alumni of our science communication minor who will be distributed out there into our own communities and doing some of this work. And maybe some of them, I would really love to see some of them going and getting masters in public health and doing things like that too, because they're going to be the ultimate leaders in this and bringing it back to their communities.
I'd actually add one more thing to this as well. Part of what we're doing on the research side is we're also training undergraduate and graduate students in how to do research. And so the people that we train ultimately themselves will go out and do research as well as science communication themselves that should help to improve things in the region and again around the nation. One other project, I wanted to give a shout out to Autumn Schaefer in the School of Journalism and Communication. She's doing some really amazing work with people up at Oregon Health and Sciences University, looking at the healthy, within the Healthy Oregon Project. And within that project, what she's looking at is they as a team are looking at developing a program to help Oregonians better understand their genetic risks for cancer. That research in turn gets fed back to some of the other scientists at Oregon Health and Sciences University who will use that data to try to better understand some of the genetic markers for cancer, so that ultimately down the road, not only are the people of Oregon helped today, but they're helped into tomorrow.
I'd add to that one another thing. And Autumn also is teaching in our PR sequence and is bringing that case to her students. And
oh,
so
I didn't know that. That's great to know.
How do you connect with rural communities? I think they started out in Clatsop County around some of these health issues. How do you get people to, donate a small vial of their saliva? It's an interesting communication question. So,
great, thank you both. For the next question, we have a comment or a question regarding, Ellen, your last phrase, which was science is complex, but our message doesn't have to be. And again, that makes sense. But also in this world where there's the risk where there's the perception that everyone's an expert, everyone can do a TED Talk, everyone can have the stadium and have the microphone and give their opinion, that's a risk. And so the reality is not everything can be explained in 17 minutes or 2-minute news story. So I guess the question is, how can we, or how is it possible to communicate to people that some topics are complex and need a little bit more than a quick little soundbite?
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. Even in the coronavirus situation, there's so much that we don't know about what's going on. Predictive models end up looking at not just what is our best guess for what's going on, but what would happen depending upon what degrees of healthy behaviors, for example, people do or they don't do. And so there's the predictive models themselves will give a best estimate, but there's actually complexity around it because it depends so much on human behavior as well as on some other factors. And so, in these kind of cases, what I would always recommend is go to your trusted sources. And so if you are faced with a situation like we all are with COVID-19, who are the trusted sources for you? And in our research, what we're finding is that there are people who obviously are involved with the medical community. There are people who are involved in public health. And in particular, it's places like the CDC. It's places like the National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Diseases. And if you start to think as you're listening to a message, maybe that's just not quite right, you should listen to that voice inside yourself and go back and look at some expert sources for that same information.
Mark, anything you might add in terms of this news storytelling world that we're in?
Well, I think, first of all, go back to the trusted sources. I'm, 1000% with Ellen on that one. And that, hopefully, the work that Ellen and researchers like her are doing is going to help reinforce sort of the way we do journalism in particular. I think that's a big piece that needs to happen here. I'm a big advocate for telling these stories and telling them well. I would also say that one story isn't going to do it. Complex issues require a lot of stories to tell them and a lot of opportunities to look at different dimensions. But people aren't going to pay attention, or people may not pay attention if you're not engaging them with whatever those stories are. So finding the ways to connect with people and tell those stories for the news organizations or for the institutions who it's falling on to tell the stories. I'm doing a dance there because I think that journalism is in a difficult spot and particularly in terms of science. There are lots of institutions though that are also providing really, really great information, CDC being one of them. So how does that news ecosystem work? And how are you analyzing personally your own news ecosystem? Are you just going to the well with one source? And what do you mean by trust, I guess, too? A lot of us will reinforce our own beliefs in going to certain sources, but stepping outside of that and challenging some of those ideas is a really good idea, too.
Great, thank you. The next question, I think it's still sort of maybe in this general space, but the comment of the question is, if scientists are data-driven and the public is emotion-driven, how do you bridge that gap?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have looked a lot, we've looked a lot at this question and looked at how do you present information, including the statistics, so that people can better understand them and better use them. And there are ways to present even fairly complicated statistics in a manner that people will use them more and they'll use stories less. And it's not that they won't use the stories, it's just that they'll do more of a balance between the story and the statistics. And honestly, both are important. The stories are what give the emotional flavor to what it is that you're reacting to and what it is that perhaps you should be doing that compel us to continue on and do that. The statistics, on the other hand, underlie a lot of our understanding of what's going on and our perspective on how big or small is the problem. And so both elements are really important, but there are ways that you can present numbers to help people to use them better.
I'll just add to that from kind of doing journalism perspective. There's a a very interesting movement in journalism now around solutions, and looking at essentially the other side of the curve of human experience that what journalism typically looks at. It's not necessarily the watchdog side, it's the evidence-based analysis of what's working in places. So, you know, if you have whatever wicked problem that's out there, who's tried something and what have we learned about it? And a lot of that is data-based. You know, to do those stories well, you really have to use the techniques of investigative reporting and data reporting to get there. And along the way, you use those techniques to find the really compelling people who will also help you tell that story, who will help you sort of you know, connect people with those numbers, with those statistics, with that really critical information. I'll just put in one other plug. I think one thing with the SCR, I hope, for the future of the J School is that we get a little bit more numeracy and math nerdiness in the building here. The journalism has had a long tradition of kind of being like, oh, I don't have to take as much math if I go there. Well, it's, you know, I think we need a subset of journalists who are really good with the numbers, because that's going to be very, very important for the next generation of journalists who are out there.
And what's interesting with that, Mark, is that not only do I think we can train journalists to be more numerate, to be better with numbers themselves, but there are also ways that there are also tricks you can teach people. Like if you yourself want to go out and present statistics to your aunt or your father or your brother, there are tricks you can use to better communicate it. And so you don't necessarily have to be highly mathematical. You just simply have to know a little bit about arithmetic, a little bit about probability, and then some of these tricks that you can use that will help people to better understand and use them. And some of the tricks that can be used are things like, first of all, figure out what your communication goal is. Even if you're talking to your aunt, your elderly aunt, let's say, decide what it is that is most important that you want to communicate to her. And don't bother her with lots of other stuff around it necessarily. You want to focus in on the goal, focus in on the goal. And then from there, you can think about let's imagine your aunt is feeling fairly anxious about the coronavirus. You can do things like talk to her about the kinds of things that I've been saying, the idea that, you know, even for somebody who gets infected, about 80% of people end up having only mild or moderate symptoms. A lot of people are expected not to be infected. It depends though on human behavior. And so helping her to quell her anxiety some by helping with that positive frame of information, but then also helping her to understand how many of us really are trying. We're trying to protect ourselves and we're trying to protect our communities. And as a result, we're trying to help protect her. Again, something like 90% of us are social distancing these days in the United States. And those kinds of communications are things that we need to be hearing from public officials, but they're also the kinds of things that we can be communicating with each other.
Fantastic. In a way, you addressed the question that I was going to pose, but I'll share it anyway. There was a question about suggestion on how to get, whether it's elderly parents, the aunt that you mentioned, how to get them to stop watching so much COVID news. And so again, I think your point about what is your objective, comes into play there. So again, I just want to make sure that the person who asked the question knows that we were able to address that. With this next question, I'm actually going to read it because I don't want to lose any of the nuances. But this question is for Ellen. In your study, are you able to distinguish people's fear from the virus from their concerns about their finances, anger about mismanagement of the crisis, frustration about health insurance, or absence of available tests? There's the virus issues, and then there's everything that comes along with it. So this person goes on, it seems like as the crisis continues, fear will be generated more by new information, the associated things beyond the core issue of the virus. So I guess any insights or information to share?
Yeah, so first, that's a great question. There are so many parts of our lives that are getting dragged into this worldwide crisis. We are probably not going to be, with our survey, we're probably not going to be able to exactly separate those things out. We actually did, in the second wave of our survey, start to look at people's, how dangerous people are starting to perceive the situation around financial issues. Things like their savings, their jobs, because a lot of people's jobs, of course, have been lost. And so we're going to do, we have a very small part of the survey that's going to be looking at some of those kinds of items. But the survey isn't intended to look at the whole vast array of things that are going to be affected by this. We are trying to hit some of the pieces. So we're trying to hit certainly fears and risk perceptions around the pandemic and what kind of behaviors people, protective behaviors people are taking. We're trying to understand a little bit about how risk perceptions for finances change across time. We're also trying to understand a bit about how racist activities seem to be increasing over time, and try to look at what is it that's predicting, for example, those racist activities, and think about, are there ways that we can communicate that might help to reduce them over time. So those are the kind of things we're looking at that are part of the pandemic, but that also go beyond the pandemic itself.
Thank you, Ellen. For the next question, it's directed at Mark. Mark, can you give us some examples of the science reporting that currently demonstrates the kind of work you're encouraging?
I think, well, I'll go to just regular hits that I'm going to. I mean, I think the New York Times has been doing a good job with it, in terms of managing that broadly. There's the COVID crisis, but then there's just looking at issues like climate change and things like that. They've got dedicated a significant amount of time and money dedicated to doing that work. All the way to the more academically oriented publications like Science and Nature that do have some more consumable content in them that the public can engage with. And so finding a way to connect the two of those. There's a wonderful startup, well, I guess not that much of a startup anymore, but The Conversation, which Ellen mentioned recently, or just earlier in her talk, is kind of a co-op of sorts. It's like an AP for science and research. And so it's they're connecting a lot of news outlets with journalistically written pieces, but they're bylined by scientists and researchers. I'm saying scientists, but researchers more broadly, because they don't just do science. And that's such a wonderful tool for really connecting the public with, kind of the frontline work of what people are doing, and having the scientists really say, hey, here's how my research fits into this broader context. Because there's sort of a push to do that with those pieces, because the aim of them is to go and land in, local regional newspapers or radio stations or, other outlets like that. So I think there are a lot of encouraging experiments that are going on out there. Plus the big old classic ones like the New York Times and, Washington Post and folks like that. I will say, I think it's very, very scary though, when we're looking at local and regional media in terms of funding the science storytelling in those spots. Those news organizations are just really financially squeezed at this point. And so we're going to have to find a societal solution for that. And I don't think that that's clear at the moment.
Great, thank you, Mark. For the next question, I think both Ellen and Mark, please feel free to address this. Again, I'm gonna read the question. Are you concerned that the message, go to media you trust, isn't that helpful or that directed? And it goes on saying, we know there's a swath of media that does not trust mainstream media, for example. Are you suggesting that it's okay for people to seek out news and information from non-journalistic sites that are not trying in good faith to report science accurately? So it does go back to, there's so many different sources of supposed experts. But again, your reaction and comments on that.
Ellen, I can jump in, but.
Go for it. I'll
Okay.
jump in after.
I think with that one, start with the science. Would be my first spot with that. don't start with the talking head. Don't start with the rumors. So going to sources you trust. I can get how someone who hears that would be like, well, yeah. I mean, as we're talking about it, it's like, well, lots of people trust things that they maybe shouldn't be trusting out there. But when we're talking about scientific issues and things where we are making decisions based on science, go to the science that's accessible to you first, and the outlets that are managing that in a in an ethical way. I think that's the real challenge. I mean, we're spending a lot of time listening to talking heads and really wanting to cling to, this new thing or that new thing or this rumor. It's like, well, I'd go back to the vaccine moment for COVID-19. That's a year plus, 18 months if it's moving really, really fast. And so there's this desire in the interim to, like, here's this cure or that cure or treatment or that treatment. It's like, with all of that stuff, you've got to go back to, what is the CDC saying about it? What are the, real reputable science sources saying about it? And then work your way out kind of in concentric rings from there around how it's getting massaged and interpreted in various media outlets.
Yeah, I think that's a great response, Mark. When we talk about going to credible sources, particularly for something like something as enormous a problem as this is, you need to be going to credible scientific sources. And there are a lot of people out there who are evaluating and interpreting not necessarily the science, but they're instead turning towards opinion. They're turning towards myth. They're turning towards conspiracy theories. And that's not going to help us. That's not going to help you as an individual, and it's not going to help us as a society. Turn to the experts, and that means the scientific experts in this case.
I'm going to throw in one other thing with that. As you said, myth, I'm like, I'm the person here advocating for story, and I'm not advocating for all stories. I think you're looking for stories that have that deep root of science that you can verify, that you can check, that you can, that there's transparency to those stories, so that you can track it back to where it's coming from, and they're dealing with the material honestly. So yeah, stories can be dangerous.
There are stories that can be really helpful here though too, Mark. There's a story, for example, of there's a guy named Justin Hargrove. He was a Detroit bus driver who ended up coming back from work one day and complaining about a passenger who had coughed on him. He died shortly thereafter from COVID-19. And he's a really gripping story about a public servant who was trying to do his job and a thoughtless passenger who ended up causing his death ultimately. And that kind of a story, in combination with the science, with the evidence on how COVID-19 statistically even is threatening us, that combination can be very powerful, because the statistics give us the science and the story helps it to stick.
And that's the combination we're trying to do here at the J School.
Wonderful. Again, we are nearing the end of our hour, and in many ways, your comments are answering questions that have been trickling in, especially how do we help our young people, teenagers, decipher the information they're getting. Social media has such a huge influence on that. Or even, for people wondering what is credible scientific source, so Mark, your comment about transparency and data. So again, all of that is so helpful. So again, I know there's still other questions, other comments. At this point, I want to make sure, we have a chance to wrap up and let you go on to again, dinner or your later snack if you're participating from another part of the country or the world. Again, I understand there were some of our international ducks who registered to participate. So with that, let me just kind of share some concluding remarks. Again, a huge thank you to both Ellen Peters and Mark Blaine for sharing their expertise with us. I think we've all improved our ability to make better decisions because of the insights they've shared with us today. I also want to point out that if you enjoyed learning and connecting with fellow ducks through this program, I hope you'll seek out other webinars and activities that you'll join, and you'll see them regularly promoted on the uoalumni.com/events website. And as I mentioned before, if you don't already receive emails from the University of Oregon, you can provide your updated information using an engagement@uoregon.edu. Last but not least, I do want to mention something that hopefully many of you have heard about already, but during these uncertain and stressful times, current students are struggling. If you have the capacity and the interest, please consider contributing to the Student Crisis Fund, Students in Crisis Fund. Students can access these funds to help offset lost income because they've lost their part-time jobs, to help them pay rent, to help them pay bills. All the contributions will make an impact on a student's life. And you can go to duckfunder.uoregon.edu/students in crisis. This webinar has been recorded, and we will make these available, and you will hear more about information on how to access this. Again, once again, thank you all so much for joining us. In my brief view of the count, we were nearly 80 duck strong for this event. So once again, in spite of our social distancing, it's great to be in community with all of you. So in the meantime, best wishes, be well, good night, and go Ducks. Thank you all.
Hi, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Go Ducks.
Thank you.